Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Markets and Morality, an IA show where we explore the differences within the classical liberal free market tent. My name is Bartha, and I'm the Director of EPICENTER, which is a network of 9 leading think tanks from across Europe. And today I'm delighted to welcome two prominent thinkers to discuss COP26 and the challenges and opportunities that a carbon neutral economy can provide. Our guests have very different opinions about net zero and COP26, but they are united in their approach in trying to solve the challenges of humanity through market mechanisms and innovation, as they both come from a classical liberal background. Bruno Prior is a trustee of the Institute of Economic Affairs and the director of Summerlees, a company that's involved in the construction, waste management, and energy sectors. And Bruno has been investing in renewable energies for over 40 years, so he has not only the theoretical, but also the practical experience of the sector. And on the other side of the debate, we are going to have Carlo Stagnaro, who's the Research and Studies Director of Istituto Bruno Leoni in Italy. He was previously the Chief of Ministers Technical Staff at Italy's Ministry of Economic Development, so he has seen the belly of the beast from the inside. And Carlo has written extensively on energy economics for both the IA and IBL, and he has assessed the climate plans of many European economies on their path to net zero. And COP26 has really been the center of the media attention for the last 2 weeks, but environmentalism has been the focus of political affairs for much longer. In Western Europe, the majority of voters under 35 call environmental policy as their number one determining factor when they're casting their votes. In Brussels and in many EU capitals, economic and trade policy goes hand in hand with environmental goals. So environmentalism is really everywhere, but it matters how centrally planned versus how market-driven environmental regulations will be. So Carlo, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on whether you accept the political goal of European countries to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And if so, what do you think is the most cost-effective way to get there?
Well, first of all, thank you for getting me involved in this debate. Well, yes, I believe that as compared with 20 or 30 years ago, the case for taking political action to cut CO2 emissions in the next few decades is much stronger. I mean, the evidence that climate change is happening, that it is mostly or maybe totally man-made, and that its consequences are not going to be good, is large and growing. So I think there can be a case. I mean, even from a free market point of view for cutting emissions. Of course, one thing is saying, okay, let's drive emissions down to zero, and one other thing is agreeing on how and who has to do what. Generally speaking, I think most economists would agree that the best way to get to the result is by pricing carbon and letting market forces work. Unfortunately, Europe, the European unions, but also the UKs and the United States, I mean, most of the developed world, is trying to achieve the result by implementing the kind of entrepreneurial state policies whereby the state or governments pick winners and losers among technologies. So that's something I think is both wrong and inefficient. But going back to your question and to express my thought in one simple point, yes, I believe there is scope for reaching net zero, and I believe it can be done by relying on free market-oriented or market-based policies.
Bruno, you have previously called net zero a flawed and irrational policy, regardless of future developments. So I do suspect that you're disagreeing with Carlo in many ways. So is the goal of net zero irrational, or the way that we're trying to get there is problematic from your perspective?
I was obviously in a moderate mood at that time. I think both is the answer. It's irrational for very basic economics. Carlo didn't explain why he believed in carbon pricing, but I think broadly we agree. The efficient amount of a pollutant, if I can use that term for greenhouse gases, is where the marginal cost of abatement, the curve crosses the marginal cost of adaptation. The government has no idea whether that point will be 100% mitigation, 0% adaptation in 2050. I personally think it is vanishingly unlikely for reasons I'd be happy to go into. But the consequence, so the practical side of it, is if you set a target like that, if the government says the world will end if we don't end carbon emissions by 2050, it can't say, oh, but we'll just find out whether we'll get there or not, which is what carbon pricing does. Carbon pricing is the antithesis of net zero, because the whole point of carbon pricing is to say, we may not get rid of all of it. It might be that the efficient amount is some amount of adaptation. So they're not complementary at all. They're actually opposite. So what net zero does is says, forget about pricing, because we have to show we're going to save the world. So we're going to pick winners. It's not coincidental, Carlo. It's actually fundamental to net zero that governments will pick the winners it thinks to get there. And they're not even going to pick very likely winners, because what you would pick right now, having no idea what things will be like in 2050, in order to get to zero, are not efficient technologies. The things that are on the table right now won't get us to zero, but they would be a good saving right now. In the meantime, our economy does much better. And that's the fundamental moral issue here. If we cripple our economy to achieve a goal that we've set by means we've set that we don't know are the right things now, we actually reduce our ability to develop the solutions we've got no idea will exist in 20 years' time when we get there, and we reduce our ability to adapt to whatever actually turns out to be more efficient to adapt to than mitigate. And actually, it's a very serious detriment to the welfare of our society.
You both seem to agree that carbon pricing and carbon taxes can be the right solution. But Carlo, you claim that they contribute to a net zero economy, whilst Bruno, you're a bit more skeptical about it. Carlo, do you wish to react to that?
Well, just 2 points. First of all, you may achieve carbon pricing by taxing carbon, which is a way. You may also achieve that by introducing cap and trade schemes, as European Union and many others around the world have done or are doing. And you can also go for some hybrid solution. That will help you to get to net zero. I agree with Bruno on one very important thing, that is that the narrative that if we don't get to net zero by 2050, the world is over and the sky will fall and so on and so forth, is absolutely wrong and ineffective. That said, I think that by implementing carbon pricing in a reasonable way, by introducing, I mean, whatever the policy tool is, like carbon tax or cap and trade or whatever, in a way that the price of carbon is reasonably high and growing over time, you may set the incentives right for both adopting low carbon or zero carbon technologies, ranging from renewable energies to nuclear power to carbon capture and sequestration. And you may also create the right incentive for businesses and researchers and inventors to innovate and deliver the kind of technologies that we do not have yet, but that I agree with Bruno will be key in the future.
But you may not, Carlo. And the point is, that's good that it's you may not, but net zero does not allow you may not. None of us knows whether we will actually get all these lovely cheap technologies that will take us to zero. It might be that the efficient amount, I strongly suspect the efficient amount is above zero. Certainly for the next 20, 30 years, I would say. Is it okay that you may not get to net zero? But then what does net zero mean if it means, well, we may or may not get there?
Well, yes and no. I think that the point of net zero, first of all, net zero in 2050 does not really mean, or does not necessarily mean zero in 2050. It's a general goal insofar as you set a direction where you want to move towards. Secondly, of course, in the next 20 or 30 years or even more possibly, we will not just gain increases in new technology that may be helpful to reduce emissions and fight climate change, but we will also reasonably have a better knowledge of the climate system. And therefore, we may find out that, for example, geoengineering technologies can be the solution, and that will solve any kind of problem. I mean, we don't know how we will get to the solution. I think, nevertheless, that if you look at what the most scientists say, a case can be made towards a major reduction in emissions over the next few years. Net zero is a political goal. It should be taken as such. It's just useful to set in motion the machine where innovation and the adoption of cleaner technologies are what really matters in the end.
So predicting the future is incredibly difficult, and I think both of you agree that the government picking winners and losers is not the right way to go. But climate change is clearly a global issue, so COP26 tries to address such a problem from a global perspective. But do you think that these international conferences and then these international agreements and government regulations are actually helping us to get closer to carbon neutral economy? Or do you think that consumer pressure and some of the shifting business priorities would have done the heavy lifting anyway? Bruno.
I mean, as far as consumer pressure goes, I've got some experience on that because we've been doing renewable energy businesses for a long time. There's a massive disparity between revealed and declared preference on this. So all consumers definitely want us to go green until you ask them to pay for it, at which point they're willing to pay for a tiny fraction of it. The way that we've fixed that in the UK is we get tax or levies on people's energy usage to pay for renewables, and then we allow them to sell the renewableness separately. And that makes the renewableness very, very cheap because it's already been paid for by taxpayers. And then you find businesses will buy that and claim to be very green. But it's not real. It's not a real thing. So I actually don't believe it's very likely. It is possible that something radical, nuclear fusion comes along, it's ridiculously cheap, and we just all go home happy. But I think it's much more likely that if you want to reduce carbon, there is a cost to that, and that people won't do it unless there's something that justifies incurring that cost. Is COP26 the right way to do it? I'm happy to accept that there has to be international discussions, that it's very hard for countries to do this unilaterally, although if you look at Sweden, they did it very well unilaterally, but we're not all Swedes, of course. What the specifics of how the COPs tend to go about it, I think, are terrible, but that's because it's governments discussing, and governments will want to do government things, and the way that governments want to do things aren't very good. But you can be a little complimentary. The proposal on forests, the proposals on gas emissions at this COP26, sometimes you can be too cynical. Those are worthwhile things, but they're hardly going to get us to net zero. But I wouldn't dismiss it, and marginal agreements like that are probably helpful, but I don't think it's the core thing.
Carlo, what do you believe the role of governments is and these international agreements when fighting climate change?
Yeah, let me start from the last sentence by Bruno. I agree that international fora are not a perfect system, but they are basically the only system we do have to create international consensus on the kind of measures that can only make sense if they are implemented internationally. I mean, the example of the fight against deforestation and the pledge to reduce methane emissions are quite easy to understand as something that you cannot achieve nationally. That said, I think that they are needed to create a framework whereby every country has to achieve its own result and to deploy its own strategy. I think that after the Paris Agreement in 2015, the functioning of COPs has totally changed in a good way. Before Paris, the idea was that you should go to the COP and the United Nations would set a target and it will implement targets and timetables, and will go after member states who don't comply and so on and so forth. And that does not and will not work. After Paris, the paradigm shift, and now it's individual countries that submit voluntary but mandatory after they have been ratified commitments on the kind of targets and the kind of measures they are willing to implement. And that is proving to be a workable solution to the big and complex issue of international coordination. Going back to the original point of Bruno, I fully agree that if you price carbon, all else being equal, you are going to depress the economy, and that may not be worth the environmental benefit that you get. But you can also design a market-based environmental policy whereby you price carbon and you use all the revenues from carbon taxes or other similar schemes to reduce other taxes in order to make the entire system revenue neutral from a fiscal point of view. If you do that, then the overall economic efficiency may even increase as opposed to the counterfactual. So there can be a way to design an environmental and climate policy which is pro-growth. Of course, I'm not saying this is, this is probably the consensus among climate economists. I'm quite skeptical, and I think I agree with Bruno on this, that this is also the consensus among policymakers, either in Europe or in the UK or elsewhere. But I mean, if we have statist politicians, the problem is not climate, the problem is statism, and that's where we should work as free market thinkers, I think.
I think we misunderstood each other, Carlo. I mean, I'm very much in favour of carbon pricing and scrapping everything else. I wasn't saying that carbon pricing causes the economic problem. In fact, I think if we scrapped all of the other mechanisms and introduced carbon pricing, we'd get an economic dividend. What I was saying is net zero causes the economic crisis because, in my opinion, some experience behind it, that we can do a certain amount, we've done a certain amount, but there are very strong diminishing marginal benefits from investments in a lot of these things at the moment. We need a magic bullet for net zero to be remotely credible, but you shouldn't base policy on a magic bullet. If you take wind and solar, we can absorb about as much as we have within our demand curve. And so that adds cost because the cost of the wind and solar is more than the cost of the avoided gas that we're not burning. But it's not a really heavy cost yet. But as you do more of it, you're producing more electricity when you don't need it because you've already started producing when the wind's blowing as much as you need, and you're not producing the electricity when you do need it because the wind's all blowing at the same time everywhere or not blowing at the same time everywhere, and the same with solar. And so what we haven't appreciated is that the marginal cost as we get further down the line of these things will get much, much higher, not just a little bit higher. And so you say you resort to storage, but the same problem, the marginal cost of storage, the first few gigawatt hours of storage will be able to do marginal swings each day, and they'll be quite valuable. As you get further and you try and do seasonal storage, the cost of seasonal storage is orders of magnitude higher, but you will need it to smooth supply and demand. That's just electricity, and then you look heat and transport, and you've got the same problems. So my point is, yes, price it, and let's find out how much is efficient, and that will probably, it won't do much harm, it might be a benefit, an economic benefit, certainly taking social costs into account.
Gentlemen, I would like to touch on a topic.
As zero, you will do massive damage.
I would like to touch on a topic where there might be a bit more agreement between the two of you than this area. So one of the key agreements, I think yesterday at COP, was that another 25 countries have committed to phase out government subsidies for fossil fuel energy by the end of 2022. The problem is, of course, that some EU countries are currently simultaneously subsidizing fossil fuel energy production and green energy production. Carlo, I know that you have done some research in this area. If there weren't any subsidies for any type of energy production, do you know how the energy production would look like in Europe at the moment? Would we be actually greener or more environmentally harmful?
Well, of course, it's hard to say, but one may argue that in Europe, subsidies to fossil fuels are relatively limited, and most of them are actually subsidies to the consumption of energy, like to truck drivers or to poor households or to energy intensive industries and the like. You may argue pro or against this kind of measures, but they are not precisely the same as a support or a direct support to fossil fuels. On the contrary, most subsidies to renewable energies are price supports. They go directly to the producers of green energy, and they are by far much higher than the environmental benefit from green energy, however however high you estimate the environmental benefit to be. Just to make an example, in my country, the implicit cost of abating CO2 with the subsidies to solar power that were in force until a few years ago were around €400 per ton of CO2. Whereas the cost of abating the same ton of CO2 in the past 10 years somewhere else in the economy, for example, by becoming more energy efficient, was around 10 or 20 euro per ton. So that is absolutely not just economically insane, but also environmentally insane. And going back to the original point, I think that the main point of divergence between Bruno and myself is that Bruno believes that net zero and carbon pricing have little or nothing to do with each other, and perhaps they contradict each other. Whereas I believe that you may make net zero and carbon pricing aligned with each other. Of course, Bruno and I agree, I think, in saying that the current policies in Europe and in Britain and the United States and so on and so forth do not pursue the right way or the most economically efficient way to reduce emissions and to save the climate, so to speak. By the way, there is a risk, I think, in the narrative going on even in COP26, in the campaign to defund any kind of investment in fossil fuels, including the low carbon fossil fuels such as natural gas, or the fossil fuels such as oil that can be hardly substituted for at the present stage of technology. And one effect of that kind of campaigns is that we are running short of fossil fuels. And this is why, exactly as we speak, energy prices are skyrocketing, causing enormous harm to the economy in general and to the poor in particular. And the true paradox is that you've got Western leaders in COP26 like Joe Biden or the European Union or the Italian government asking Russia and North Africa and Middle Eastern countries to produce more oil and more natural gas. But at the same time, we are not releasing any longer authorizations to explore and produce fossil fuels from our own reserves. And that's totally irrational and hypocritical, I think.
I would like to follow up on that point, and especially from a geopolitical perspective, because it seems obvious that Western countries, EU, UK, Canada, are making much bigger commitments to reduce emissions and to reduce the impact of climate change than many of the lower middle income countries. Carlo, you have mentioned that currently electricity and gas prices are skyrocketing in Europe, partially thanks to Putin and limiting Russian gas exports, but partially because of our own decisions, because we banned fracking, for example, in the vast majority of EU countries. So, Bruno, what do you actually think about the kind of geopolitical impact of net zero? Do you think that it helps or kind of hinders the stability and the geopolitical aims of Western countries?
Well, half cynically, I think in a way it's helpful, because I'm not big on geopolitics or geopolitical aims of countries. And by crippling our economy, if we continue to pursue it, I think it will significantly reduce our ability to pursue geopolitical aims. We'll be reduced to countries begging other countries to do business with us, and that'll be our limit. And perhaps that's a good thing. But realistically, we might wish there wasn't such a thing as geopolitics, but countries like China and Russia will continue to pursue it. And it would be very nice if there were an effective counterbalance to authoritarianism. A liberal, the West should stand for the liberal alternative to authoritarianism. We've been failing anyway. And if we continue to pursue net zero, we will fail dismally. No country will look at us and think, well, that's a good way to do it. We'd be better off having a big, powerful man in charge.
Another point that's kind of linked to the geopolitical aims of Western countries is linked to tariffs and trade. So, Carlo, I know that you have been working on the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is the use idea of essentially putting tariff or import taxes on carbon-intensive goods. What do you think about it? Do you think that's actually a helpful endeavor in order to encourage other countries such as China or India to produce in a more environmental friendly way, or it's just another kind of protectionist measure that you politicians are trying to introduce?
Well, I think that it can be useful in theory, whereas in practice, the risk that it turns out to be a little more than a protectionist effort is very high. CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, are in principle a very nice instrument insofar as they allow to price the carbon embedded in imported goods in the same way that you price carbon domestically, and therefore they are supposed to eliminate any trade distortions. However, in practice, it is almost impossible to design the perfect CBAM, for example, because it is very hard to know what is the actual content of CO2 of the imported goods, and also because the importers or the producers of goods abroad have many ways to engage in gaming and therefore go around the alleged obligations. So I think that all in all, the benefits from real world CBAM would be quite small, and it may be more easy to keep in place the existing measures that support the domestic energy intensive and trade exposed producers in order to create some sort of level playing field. So that is a very big discussion, but my feeling is that it will go to nowhere, even though there are a couple of recent examples of countries that have started to implement some form of internal carbon pricing or measures to reduce the carbon content of the exported goods, claiming that they are doing this in order to stop the EU from introducing CBAM. So my point in a way is that CBAM is very good as a threat. It may be very bad as a policy.
Great, thanks, Carlo. So both of you have actually commended COP26 in some ways, whilst also critiquing it. But if you had kind of a magic wand and you could determine the perfect outcome of COP26, what would the perfect outcome look like from your perspective, Bruno?
The countries all agree to implement carbon dividend. I think Carlo and I are both advocating that. People should Google carbon dividend if they don't know what it is. It's a variation on carbon tax that tries to deal with some of the most commonly commented objections to it. Apart from that, I feel probably most strongly that the West has to insist on equitable behavior by China in particular. I have more sympathy for other countries who are at an earlier development stage, but China now has higher carbon emissions per capita than we do. And that is beyond a stage where we say, oh, they get a special deal. And so I would be saying if China doesn't behave in the same way as we do, we are going to have another meeting next year like we always do anyway.
Carlo?
Yeah, I fully agree. My magic wand would point towards a global carbon dividend mechanism, as Bruno said. And I also fully agree that China and India are different stories. I mean, Indians have emissions that are as low as 1/3 of Europe's, and they've got a GDP per capita which is 1/7 of ours. So I think it's totally immoral to ask them to do, to take major steps towards reducing emissions, even though, of course, we have to ask them to use the existing and future technologies to reduce the carbon footprint underline their future economic growth. The Chinese have per capita emissions which are as high as or even higher than ours. They've got a lower GDP per capita. That means that their economy is very carbon inefficient. And there is a scope for reducing carbon emissions in China and for asking China to take concrete and significant steps towards reducing their environmental impacts while not giving up, of course, on their right to economic growth.
Carlo, Bruno, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. I very much enjoyed listening to your different perspectives. And I hope so did our audience. So if you have enjoyed the debate, make sure to follow iLondon on Twitter and hit the subscribe button below this video. And also special thanks to our donors, without whom our work at the IA would not be possible. And if you do wish to contribute and support our work, please do consider subscribing to our IA Patreon account, where you can receive exclusive content and have a sneak peek into some of the behind the scenes discussions as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time again.